Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar in our ICB series. It's really great to have so many of you joining. I can hear the little ping telling me that lots of people are being admitted now, so welcome. My name is Esther Venning. I'm a partner at Dickinson, and I'm joined this morning by Emma. Emma, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Emma Stockwell, and I'm a partner at Dickinson as well.
So this morning we are talking to you about governance perspectives in ICBs, and we're going to reflect on some of the key issues that we're seeing in advising ICBs. There's lots of things that are coming up in common kind of areas, so hopefully lots of it will chime with you, and hopefully we might be able to help you with some of those queries as well. Just some housekeeping before we start. You'll see that all of your cameras and mics are just automatically switched off. That's because of the sheer number of people that we're expecting this morning. However, if you do have questions, there will be an opportunity at the end. We're hoping to address any questions that you've got. So if they occur to you as we're going along, then do pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. As you can see, you should have had a little notification. We're also recording this morning's session. So just to be aware of that, and we will send you the slides after the session together with the link for the next two webinars in our series around complex commissioning and workforce issues in ICBs. So without further ado, we will crack on. So the agenda for today, what we're looking at is I'm going to start by just setting a bit of context for ICBs and looking at some of the core functions of ICBs and the triple aim, and looking at the ICB's place within the system. We'll then swiftly move on to talk about delegation, and Emma's going to talk about that. That's definitely one of the key areas we're seeing a lot of queries on at the moment. And then I'm going to talk about how the ICB might operate at place. Again, something that we're doing a lot of work on across the country. And then we're going to end with conflicts of interest, which I'm sure will provoke some questions and is definitely a key issue in the new system. And as I said, we'll move on to questions and some discussion at the end in whatever time we've got left. So let's start by setting a bit of the context. So the ICB, as you can see within the system there, it's taken on the functions of all of its predecessor CCGs within the area. Sorry, I've just seen a comment from somebody who can't hear me. Hopefully other people can hear me, but do let us know if you can't. Sorry, so the ICB has taken on the functions of CCGs within its area. Most ICBs across the country do cover multiple former CCG areas. So they're covering multiple places and place-based partnerships. They've taken on those former CCG commissioning functions, but they have generally a much bigger geographical reach than CCGs had previously. And that means that the operating model that CCGs are looking to develop to discharge their functions across that bigger geographical area is actually quite complicated. And I think it's fair to say that most ICBs are still working that through in terms of how they actually function. And we'll come on to that shortly when Emma talks about delegation, because that's one of the key areas that people are looking at. The system also includes, in grey there, the collaborative structures. So those are the things that are not statutory bodies or legal entities, but they are still collaborations of organisations. Now, some of them were there before ICBs were established, so place-based partnerships being an obvious one, but they were very much informal kind of structures. Provider collaboratives, which operate at a much broader level generally across ICB footprints, are much more emerging, but we are seeing a lot more activity in terms of how they operate and what sorts of functions they might take on. And I think with those collaborative structures alongside, I think that, again, that's another factor that makes it perhaps a bit more complicated for ICBs to work out how they deliver their functions and how they, play a part in place-based partnerships in particular, but also how they interact with provider collaboratives and what the provider collaboratives will do vis-a-vis the ICBs. So it's quite a complicated picture overall. So if we just move on to look at some of the key functions and duties of ICBs, one of the key legislative changes in the Health and Care Act 2022 was the introduction of the triple aim, and that's the duty to have regard to the wider effect of the organisation's decisions on 3 key areas. And this duty was put forward by, it was a change to the Health and Care Bill that was put forward by the NHS itself to government and accepted into the Act. And it applies to all of those bodies in the top right hand corner there. So all of those NHS statutory bodies have the same duty. And the idea is then that you get better quality of decision making and consistency of decision making, and you're cooperating with each other when looking at the wider effects of your decisions on the population. So there's 3 key elements there that ICBs need to have regard to in terms of the effects of their decisions. So one is the health and well-being of the people of England, the second, the quality of services, and thirdly, is no surprises, efficiency and sustainability in terms of the use of resources by NHS organisations. Now, A and B there, health and wellbeing and quality of services, is where the inequalities considerations are really baked in for every NHS organisation. So the effects of the decisions include effect in relation to inequalities for A and B. So ICB functions, they are generally made up of things that the ICB has to do, so they're obliged to do them, things the ICB can do, so they may do them, it's at their discretion, but they don't have to do them. And thirdly, then the general duties that the ICB has got to comply with when delivering those activities and functions. So the activities the ICB must carry out, as you can imagine, include their commissioning functions, so they have to commission services across their population in line with the Act. They must, for example, publish a constitution, but they may do things like generate income in certain circumstances. So they're often referred to as their powers. In terms of their general duties, I'm not going to spend too long on this because most of these duties are the same as CCGs had. So there's just 1 or 2 additions. The first one being the triple aim, which we've just talked about, and the second one being climate change, which was introduced. And again, that's a common duty that applies to all NHS statutory bodies now as part of the Health and Care Act. But all of those there, including that promotion of integration, was broadly there for, they were broadly there for CCGs, so you already had to comply with those as a CCG. There's just more emphasis around inequalities again in that final one on integration. Okay, so having cantered through functions and duties and just setting the scene a little bit there, I will hand over to Emma to talk about delegation.
Great, thanks, Esther. Just take control of the slides. I think I've got them. So delegation. This is one of those topics that seems to be something that a lot of people are discussing at the moment. Just because the ICBs are obviously looking at what they are going to delegate by way of functions, if any, post their establishment last July. So there are a number of ways in which the ICBs can basically exercise their functions. So the first way is that they obviously carry out the function themselves, so they don't actually delegate it at all, or if they do, it's through internal delegation, whether that's to committees or officers or employees of the ICB. The second way is that they actually delegate externally, so they delegate the responsibility for carrying out the function to 1 or more other organisations, which we'll come on to in a second. And thirdly, they can actually jointly exercise those functions with other organisations as well, potentially using the mechanism of joint committees, which again we'll come on to in a second. The one thing I think to say in terms of delegation or deciding where the function is best being exercised is to actually look at the purpose of the function and then to determine the level at which that function is best exercised. So there is no requirement to delegate if in fact the function is best exercised at the ICB level by the ICB internally. But if the decision is to externally delegate the function, then there are a number of places at which that function can be carried out. So you're looking at whether it's a function that should be exercised at a national level or a regional level or a system level, place level, etc. So the best level at which it will be carried out is the level at which that function is best exercised, because it makes sense to exercise it at that particular level. So as I say, there's no particular requirement to delegate. It's what's best for that particular function. So this slide is just an overview of how sort of delegation will effectively work in a sort of picture form. Sorry, it looks a little bit complicated. But essentially the green bit on the right hand side is the internal delegation bit, where the ICB decides to either reserve decisions to its own board or to delegate those internally to, as I said before, committees, officers, employees, etc. On the left hand side, in the sort of yellow orange colour, we have lots of collaboration potentially going on, even where the function is exercised internally within the ICB. So obviously lots of sort of two-way collaborations with others across the system, local authorities, other NHS partners, etc. And then on the top left, you have the sort of external delegation options, essentially. So external delegation to providers, NHS providers, whether that's to one provider, perhaps it will be in future to provider collaboratives, and also to local authorities, potentially as commissioners or providers. And then on the very top left, you have delegation to place. And we'll talk a little bit about place in a second in terms of that delegation. But essentially, the delegation to place will be delegations into the place-based partnership, however that may be set up, and that differs from place to place. And as I say, we'll look at that in a second in terms of delegation at place level. So that's the sort of different ways in which the ICB can delegate. There is statutory guidance that was produced by NHSE last year in September, which is still valid now, still functional now, around arrangements for delegation and the joint exercise of statutory functions. And what that does is deal with the new sort of powers and arrangements for joint working that the Health and Care Act of last year actually introduced into legislation. So the NHS Act of 2006 has been updated and amended by last year's Act to introduce some joint working powers. Now, NHS trusts and foundation trusts as NHS bodies have to have regard to the guidance, so they must have regard to it. The guidance says that local authorities may find it useful, and that's simply because local authorities are obviously one of those partner bodies within a system, within a place, that may be working with NHS bodies in order to exercise NHS functions and its own functions. There are some regulations that have been produced which list functions which should never be delegated, but at the moment those only cover the regulatory and overview functions of NHSE, which understandably the regulations are saying cannot be delegated to other organisations, but it doesn't cover any other ICB particular functions for now. So whether further legislation will come out restricting the ability to delegate, we don't know, but at the moment there isn't anything of that nature. What the guidance very clearly sets out is that the legislation around joint working and delegations is permissive. So it doesn't specify a set of circumstances in which you have to delegate or you have to jointly work with other organisations. It is just an ability to do so by way of the powers within the legislation. Now, we know from sort of at the end of last year, following the establishment of ICBs, that NHSE was saying that they didn't expect any bodies, any NHS bodies, to use these new powers for joint working. That's now we're coming to the end of the 22-23 financial year. The expectation is that bodies will now start using some of these delegation powers and joint working powers. But remember that they are still very much in their infancy in terms of use. And so it will probably take a while for these powers to actually be used in the way that was probably envisaged when the legislation was produced. So they're still very much, as I say, in their infancy, really, in terms of people using them. Just one thing to mention, which we've put on the slide, is that there is something called a conferral of discretion, where basically either NHSE or an ICB, when they're commissioning activities from another organisation, from an NHS body, can actually confer a discretion. And what the guidance says is that this can be used, for example, to confer a discretion on providers when commissioning activity from providers. So, for example, allowing providers to take on population health activities relating to the contracted provision of services. So it's called a conferral of discretion, so giving them a power to do something basically. And it could be used potentially as a bit of an alternative or a stepping stone towards a more formal delegation in the future. And we've seen, we've certainly been involved in conversations where that sort of delegation has been discussed in terms of just conferring a power on providers by way of the contractual arrangements for them to actually do something over and above traditional provision and get involved a little bit in deciding how monies are spent on the provision of services. So it's a bit of a halfway house, and as I say, maybe a stepping stone that's used by ICBs before formal delegation actually happens or is considered in future. So that's the NHSE guidance. So I've talked about the new sort of powers for joint working. We've called them sort of tools in this slide. So the new powers essentially are around the formation of joint working arrangements and joint committees. And we've set all of this out on the slide just so that you've got something to go back to in reference. So it's the section 65 said 5 of the NHS Act. It sounds a bit of a mouthful. I think we've all got used to saying it now. But that's the section of the Act that essentially introduces this new power for relevant bodies, which are on the slide there, NHS bodies, to arrange for functions to be exercised by another relevant body or jointly exercised between it and another relevant body or bodies. And where the function is going to be exercised jointly, then there is a power to establish a joint committee and actually a pooled fund as well for that purpose. The expectation is that any such arrangements will be set out in a form of delegation agreement where you are actually delegating powers. Where you're jointly exercising powers by way of a joint committee, then obviously the expectation would be that that would be enshrined within your governance documents as an organisation, within your scheme of delegation, etc. So that those arrangements are documented within those governance documents. So that's the new power that's been established by the Act from last year. Don't forget that we do still have Section 75 of the NHS Act, which allows local authorities and now the ICBs and also NHS trusts in some cases, so they can be provider Section 75 arrangements, but in the main they are commissioning arrangements whereby the local authorities or combined authorities enter into arrangements to exercise functions jointly under Section 75 with an ICB. So in this case, we're talking about an ICB arrangement with a local authority under Section 75. And in the same way as we've just looked at with 65Z5, under Section 75, those functions can be exercised jointly by way of a joint committee and funds can be pooled as well for that purpose. So that's the exercise of ICB functions and local authority health related functions that can be exercised in that way. And that Section 75 hasn't been affected or changed at all by the new Act from last year. So that is very much still the tool that is used and will be used for that sort of joint collaboration between local authorities and NHS bodies. And the reason for that is because Section 75 is quite restrictive when it comes to local authority functions, because it doesn't allow the local authority functions to be exercised in that way by local authorities under Section 65 said 5. It only allows NHS functions to be exercised in that way. And that's why I say the Section 75 function and ability under Section 75 of the NHS Act will very much remain the way in which local authority functions, health-related functions, will be carried out jointly with NHS bodies. Just a little thing to say on the slide is that double delegation is permitted. So a function can be delegated and then delegated again. But don't forget, of course, that where you do that, obviously there is some complexity to how that is carried out. and where the accountability, liability and responsibility then lies, where you're delegating and then delegating again. So just be wary of those sort of arrangements in terms of managing the complexity of them. So just a brief slide, just in terms of NHSE delegation down to ICBs. We know that at the moment ICBs have assumed delegated responsibility for primary medical services. The intention, I think this is still right, the intention is that pharmaceutical, ophthalmic and dental services will be delegated down from April. And whilst there was an expectation that also from April some specialised commissioning functions would also be delegated to ICBs, the intention now from the planning guidance, as we understand it, is that there will be some statutory joint committees formed between ICBs and NHSE for the purposes of overseeing the commissioning of some of those specialised functions over the next financial year, with delegation then happening perhaps from April next year. So that's been put back slightly. So the expectation, as I say, is that we will see or should see some joint committees being formed between ICBs and NHSE for that purpose from this April. And those joint committees will, we assume, follow the same function as the previous slide in terms of how that actually works under section 65 said 5 in terms of being able to exercise those functions jointly using that new power. So that's NHSE delegations. So a slide here just to talk about responsibility, accountability and liability. What do we mean by those three words? And I think these are used interchangeably, and sometimes it can get quite confusing as to what we mean, whether legally or just in sort of layman's terms. So responsibility for a function is where a body has the obligation, the responsibility to carry out some or all aspects of that function. So the responsibility can sit with the body who has the function under legislation, under statute, or the responsibility can sit with somebody else because that function has been delegated to that somebody else or some other body. So that's where the responsibility is who has the obligation to carry out the function, whose responsibility is it to do the doing, to do that function. The liability, so where so the statute states that where you delegate a function to another body, that other body will bear the liability of exercising that function. So anything that body does, or the body that is exercising the function has the liability in respect of the exercise of that function. Now, the body that initially had the function, that delegated the function, can still bear some liability, for example, if they've delegated the function unlawfully, for example, or if their negligence or their action has caused some form of liability to transpire. But ordinarily, the body that is exercising the function will carry the liability for the exercise of that function. So, for example, if I was carrying out the function and I was negligent or I did something that caused a liability to arise, then that liability would be mine because it's my fault I exercised that function. So the liability would normally sit with the person, the organisation carrying out the function. So that will include liability, for example, to respond to any legal proceedings or claims, remedies ordered by the court, etc. The liability sits with that body. Now, accountability is a little bit different because accountability is who is ultimately accountable for the exercise of that function. And that can be a little bit complex because ordinarily the body that has the function under statute retains the accountability. So, for example, when NHSE delegates down to primary medical services to ICBs, the liability sits with the ICBs. In most cases, the responsibility sits with the ICBs, but ultimately NHSE retains accountability for that function. But there can be sort of nuances in that ICBs, for example, under the delegation agreement, can have some accountability for what it does. So, for example, NHSE can't be accountable for something that the ICB does if the ICB has been given the function of doing that and is therefore accountable for exercising that function. But ultimately, accountability will sit with the organisation that has or has been given that function under statute. But accountability, as I say, is slightly nuanced because it can mean that when you delegate functions down to another organisation, that other organisation or body retains or has some accountability in terms of the exercise of that function, because the fact that they've accepted that delegation. But it can be used, as I say, interchangeably with responsibility and liability, and it can get a little bit complex. As we've said on sort of arrows to the right of that slide, the delegation or the joint exercise of functions, the liability, responsibility and accountability can shift or be shared depending on what those arrangements are. So whenever you're entering into any arrangements for delegation or joint working, I think the message here is just to be very careful about ensuring that it's clear who has responsibility, who has liability and for what, and who retains accountability or has accountability for that function or particular aspects of that function, and be very clear in the arrangement sort of where all of those sit and which bodies have those responsibilities and accountabilities. I think, yeah, that brings me to a close on those slides. So I will hand back to Esther and we'll have a little look at how the ICB operates at place.
Thanks, Emma. Hopefully I've taken control now. So let's have a look at place. And I've only got a couple of slides, and this could actually be, I think, a webinar in itself. So we'll try and keep it brief, but it is definitely something that is I mean, we've been, I would say, advising on place-based partnerships and how they form for probably about 5 or 6 years. And obviously we've had the shift to ICBs as of last year, and lots of areas are now looking at how they can further develop their place-based partnership arrangements, but in particular ICBs are grappling in a lot of cases with how they operate at place level. So taking into account what Emma said about delegation, how do they delegate to place? How do they give place the resource and the control the place-based partnerships need and want to be able to commission and deliver services for their population that are right for their population? Because as I said earlier, if ICBs are covering multiple place-based partnerships, which most of them are, those place-based partnerships will all be different and have different populations, different geographies. Some will be in cities, some will be rural. There will be all sorts of different population needs. So how the ICB operates that place is really key to enabling that resource to come through into place and for place to have that control. So we go right back, and when I look back at when this was published, so Thriving Places was the guidance that was published in September 2021, which feels like a long time ago now, and effectively that is still our key place-based partnership guidance, if you like, in terms of the potential models that place-based partnerships can take forward, but importantly how the models for ICBs to operate at place. And it's easy to confuse the two, and hopefully I'll try and explain that in a bit more detail. So that Thriving Places guidance basically set out who should be involved in place-based partnerships as a minimum, and that obviously includes the ICB, but also, as on the slide there, primary care, voluntary sector, the local authority is a key partner, because most place-based partnerships are coterminous with local authority areas, and also representatives of the people who actually access care of service users. And the guidance then suggested that ICBs could establish any combination of the following 5 governance arrangements. Now, it's really important to emphasise the word combination, because none of these things in the boxes will necessarily enable all of the partners to put something into the pot at place, if you like, to put resources in. Some of them only enable ICB resources to come into place and to be used at place, rather than the other organisations, so the local authority, for example. So most of these models need to be combined with other forms of governance at place to really have that full partnership working and the full resource of place. from all of the partners. So it's a little bit more complicated than it looks on this slide, and I think most ICBs are now alive to that as well, that it's not just a case of necessarily having a director of the ICB sitting at place with delegated authority. That isn't going to bring in the resource that you need from the other partners in the place, from the local authority, from the NHS organisations, and then that's before we get onto the non-statutory organisations that are part of it. So the 5 models that were set out in Thriving Places are set out there. The first one is very much an informal consultative forum, and I would say that most place-based partnerships across the country would probably have a consultative forum already there before the ICB was established last July. And that consultative forum is just what it says on the tin. So it can't take decisions on behalf of the partners. It's not a committee of anybody. It's literally a group of usually senior leaders sitting around the table and discussing key issues for that place-based partnership, key issues for their population and how they might work together to resolve them. Any formal decisions of those organisations would, generally speaking, then have to go back to their organisational boards or governing bodies or whatever they are to actually take that decision in an aligned way. So most areas would already have a consultative forum. Some of them are still operating on that basis, but it doesn't enable the formal delegation from anybody into that forum. The individual directors of the ICB was the second model that the Thriving Places guidance flagged, and that's very basically the slide that Emma showed earlier in terms of internal delegation. That would be an ICB director, say commonly called a place director in lots of areas, would be an employee of the ICB, generally speaking, and they would then have delegation from the ICB centrally up to a certain delegated limit in the usual way, and they would then be able to take decisions about those resources up to that level of delegation, and they may choose to do that within a broader forum arrangement, so that 1 and 2 in that slide might be combined, for example. That is a model that we know is in place in some ICBs at the moment, very much as a first step, I think, towards a further development of a more collaborative arrangement, so to try and bring in more partners into the arrangements. The third one there is the committee of the ICB, and again this is internal delegation as per Emma's slide. So this is the ICB forming a committee, and that committee would be at place level. So it would include members from the various partner organisations. And the committee itself would be able to take decisions, and it potentially can take them on a majority basis, so it wouldn't necessarily have to take them by consensus. And those decisions within the remit of that committee would then bind the ICB. So that's a really key mechanism, and that's quite a common way, I think, probably the most common model that we're seeing at the moment in terms of taking decisions and getting resources into place, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in terms of what that looks like. The fourth one, which I think is fair to say, when it was published, did set a few hairs running in terms of a lot of people got quite excited, or maybe it was just us governance geeks got quite excited about, well, we could have a joint committee of all of the partners. It's not quite that straightforward, and as Emma said, that's section 65Z5 in the main. It's not that straightforward because the local authority cannot delegate its own functions and resources via 65Z5. It would still have to do that via section 75. So again, we'd need to combine those elements in order to bring bring the local authority into that picture, insofar as the local authority wants to put in resource and function. So we'd need to look at combining that with section 75. The fifth one there was lead provider, and that's very much, I think that's still a model that is on the table for the future, and is very much a kind of ultimate endpoint, I think, in some areas. So, I'm talking to some areas at the moment who are starting to look at how can we actually almost operate a provider collaborative at place level, such that a lead provider might take delegated resources and decision making from the ICB under a delegation agreement and actually have a contract for the delivery of full perhaps out of hospital services across the population, and then work together in a collaborative with other organisations, including, for example, a local authority, primary care, at place level to deliver that. I'm not aware that anyone's actually doing that yet in terms of having that formal delegation from the ICB. And in the main, that's because the guidance has been such, as Emma said, that it's been very much a don't do that this year, we're not ready. ICBs aren't ready for that, but definitely some areas are starting to look at that for future models. So how does that look within the system? So I've just said there about how we need to combine these governance models in order to have that full partnership arrangement at place, in order for the other partners to try to bring in their resources, and in particular the local authority, because the local authority resource is key to play. So think about the Section 75 that every ICB has in each local authority area with the local authority. That, generally speaking, is a massive proportion of the commissioning budget at place. So the Better Care Fund obviously is the the cornerstone of that. So without that in play as part of the wider partnership arrangements, it seems that is how you're going to get the bulk of the resource into the decision making at place. So in order to do that, you then need to look at how you combine Section 75 governance, whatever that is, with your wider partnership governance. So it can start to get a little bit complicated. And I have to say, not all areas are necessarily at the point at which they want to bring in their Section 75 governance into the wider forum of the other partners in the place, hearing those discussions and taking part in those discussions. But a lot of areas are starting to look at this because they recognise that Better Care Fund is a massive proportion of that place budget, and so it makes complete sense for the local authority and ICB commissioning arrangements to be within the remit of that wider place partnership. So what we're starting to see is those kind of governance elements coming together in some areas, not all of them in every area, but generally speaking, the most common those common way of the ICB decision making to come into place is that ICB committee that I mentioned before. So the ICB committee at place would potentially meet at the same time as, for example, the Section 75 governance arrangement. So same time, same place, and they'd just be very clear about what they're making decisions on at what point and what hats each of those people is wearing around the table. And we'll come on to conflicts in a minute. And then you could then combine that with your wider collaborative forum for the place partnership that you may already have. So that's one potential option for structuring your place partnership. So it might look like one meeting with this broadly the same people around the table, but underneath we've got this governance wiring of the different groups and the different functions and resources that we're making decisions about. So in terms of that middle box on that last slide there, in the committee of the ICB at place, I've mentioned that this is probably the most common model that ICBs, I think, are looking at in terms of getting their resources into place. So again, it's internal delegation. We're not externally delegating anything. But one of the key features of that ICB committee is that it's similar way to CCGs could do. They can include members from partner organisations. So that committee doesn't just have to be ICB employees or officers. It can include, for example, somebody from the acute trust, somebody from primary care. It can include somebody from the voluntary sector. And they are members of that committee, so they would be making decisions on behalf of the ICB together with the other members of the committee. But it's important to remember that whilst those people are sitting on that committee, they are not delegates or representatives of their organisations. They are there to bring their sector expertise, so their primary care expertise if they're a primary care representative, for example. And that's very much the same principle as for the ICB board. So we have partner members on ICB boards from the acute trusts or from local authorities. Again, they are not there as delegates of their organisations. They're there to bring their perspective from their particular sector. That's quite a difficult place to be potentially in some area. And we'll come on to conflicts of interest because that's very relevant, because we sometimes have people sitting on these committees who are wearing multiple hats. So they're making decisions for the ICB, part of that committee, but they also might be a chief exec of the local acute trust. And so that's going to give rise to potentially a few difficult issues as we start to make more difficult decisions. But it is that the fact that they can bring in members from other organisations into those committees is a useful way of really making that a partnership arrangement, albeit all it can do is look at ICB resource at place and ICB functions, but it can include those wider partner organisations, and that's the model that lots of areas have started to either implement or are looking at implementing. So because it's an ICB committee, it has delegated authority from the ICB to look at making decisions about ICB matters within its remit. It's accountable to the ICB, and it looks at the allocation of ICB resource. Now, obviously, the million-dollar question in all of these arrangements is, what is the ICB going to delegate? So that is a conundrum for lots of areas that I'm working with. You know, what is the level that we're willing to delegate to this new thing, to this new committee? You know, how do we then get the assurance back from that place-based committee that that resource is being allocated appropriately in accordance with the ICB's strategy, in accordance with its plan? How do we, you know, and all of that needs to be worked through as you set these things up in terms of reporting mechanisms, etc. Because it's an ICB committee, obviously has to operate in accordance with the ICB constitution and standing orders, etc. And the ultimate decision in terms of obviously the remit of the committee, but also its membership and how it operates, how the voting works, etc., has to be approved by the ICB itself. So that's the approval mechanism. And as I said before, in order to bring in the wider functions and resources of other partners at place, which is the point of place-based partnerships, we do need to look at how we combine that then with other governance mechanisms, as I showed in that diagram. So if we can bring in, for example, a local authority resources into that, then we need to work out ways of combining that we can keep streamlined, and that's the trick, not to make it too complicated. But we can make it streamlined, but so that we do have that resource at place, and we can start to actually allocate that for the benefit of the place population. So that was a quick canter through the ICB at place, and we touched on conflict. So I'm going to hand over to Emma at this point.
Thank you. I suppose just one thing, just to make very clear, when we're talking about the ICB delegating to place, as Esther's talked about with the committee structure and the other governance sort of wraparound structures at place partnership level, is that is obviously it's an internal delegation to an ICB committee operating at place, but it's obviously involving external partners, and so it's a way to bring all of the partners together at place and exercise those ICB functions at place. I suppose the one point just to make clear is that that's very different to what we know is happening at the moment within ICBs, whereby ICB employees and officers are operating at place. So, for example, where an ICB is still operating very much on sort of old CCG footprints, for example, because their officers and employees are grouped together at place levels and operating at place levels. That's an internal sort of operation mechanism, whereby, as I say, employees are operating at place former CCG footprint levels. Obviously, that's distinct from what Esther's just been talking about, which is actually delegating functions into an ICB committee at a place level that involves other partners at place. So just to make that distinction, because as you know, I think that there's a lot of conversations going on at the moment about what's happening at place, and I think there are lots of different things happening at place. But the ICB committee is just sort of one element of that in terms of how the ICB delegates to place partners, but keeps it within an internal delegation by delegating to an ICB committee, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. Okay, so conflicts. I don't intend to say an awful lot on conflicts, primarily because there isn't an awful lot to say on conflicts any more than there was sort of 2-3 years ago, or more now, when the NHS sort of e-guidance came out on managing conflicts. But we thought it was an important topic to cover, just to finish off this sort of governance webinar, because it has been a topic that I know has been plaguing a number of you for some time in terms of how conflicts are managed. And I know that as the ICB boards have been established, and as other forums like the place partnership committees are being established, it comes up more and more in conversation. So we just thought we'd touch on it. So these slides are really just so that you've got something there to look back on. As Esther said, we'll circulate them afterwards. I don't intend to go through them all in detail. But this slide just essentially sets out the legal requirements that we have for conflicts, which are imposed now on ICBs, formerly obviously imposed on CCGs. So the legislation has been amended now so that the same requirements as regards declaring interests and managing interests are now imposed on ICBs in the same way as they were on CCGs. So in respect of ICBs, the duty to make arrangements for managing declarations of interest and managing interests applies in respect of both members of the board, members of committees and subcommittees, but also all ICB employees. So that requirement by statute to declare interests and manage those appropriately is there for all ICB employees. And the duty, as I say on the slide, is to make arrangements to manage conflicts and potential conflicts so that they don't and don't appear to affect the integrity of decision-making processes. And those arrangements are included in ICB constitutions, and there are registers of interests, which obviously ICBs have a requirement to publish in the same way as CCGs. So slight tweak to the legal requirements, but just to impose the same requirements on ICBs. We then have, in addition to the statute, guidance on managing conflicts. And we have the NHS e-guidance that came out in 2017, which seems an awfully long time ago now. But just to say that what we're emphasising here is that guidance is very much still in force, is still very much applicable, and hasn't been amended to say anything different than it did when it was first produced. And under General Condition 27 of the NHS Standard Contract that you will use, the ICB will use to commission services from providers, this guidance is applicable to those providers as well in the same way, and that general condition sort of obliges them to have regard to the guidance in the same way as other NHS bodies have to have regard to it. There was, if you remember, some statutory guidance for CCGs that was updated following the 2017 sort of cross-sector guidance. Which was specifically for CCGs. Now that hasn't been updated since the establishment of ICBs, so there is no similar guidance that has now been produced for ICBs. Whether there will be, I don't know. Not heard of anything of that nature. But the previous CCG guidance hasn't been reproduced or updated in that sense. But the principles are still very much exactly the same as they were and will apply to ICBs in exactly the same way as they applied to CCGs. And that's why I've sort of said on the slide that in terms of things like the guidance being applicable as it was for CCGs to GP partners and individuals in GP practices, for example, it will have the same applicability now for ICBs in terms of anyone involved with the business or decision making of the ICB, including members of ICB committees, etc. GP practices are still being required to declare interests in the same way as they were before. There is no change to the requirements in terms of how the ICB operates versus how the CCGs used to operate. I've just kept this this slide as it is, just again as a bit of an aide-memoire about what do we mean when we talk about a conflict of interest. And the reason I've put it on there, I won't go through it in detail because I think we all know what we mean by it. But again, just so you've got something on a slide. The reason I've put it in there is simply because when we come to look at the lists of what we mean by interests, so we think about whether somebody has an interest, and then we think about whether there's a conflict of that interest with an interest that they have for the organisation they're taking a decision for. And I think the one thing, we're all familiar obviously with financial interests where somebody can benefit from the taking of a decision or an action that they take as an employee. Somebody can benefit professionally, but not financially, but it could be professional benefit. They could get a personal benefit from doing something. They could have an indirect interest because they have a close association with somebody who has an interest. But I think that the key one for me that seems to be the one that is biting more, I think, for all of these new structures within the system is loyalty interest, and what I sort of call organizational interest. So this is basically where somebody's interest is simply that they are an officer or they're engaged by 2 or more organisations. So, for example, those that sit on the ICB board that come from other organisations obviously are sort of wearing 2 hats. As Esther said, they're not delegates of their organisation, but they've come to bring their particular experience to the ICB board. But they still have an interest in that other organisation because they are still an officer or an employee of that other organisation that they've come from. But they also now have an interest for the ICB because they're sitting on the ICB board. So that's what I call sort of organisational, or the guidance refers to them as, or did refer to them in 2017 as loyalty interest, where you have a loyalty to other organisations, for example, and those interests are obviously becoming more and more common. Because we have those forums like the ICB board where under statute there are lots of different individuals on those forums from within and outside the ICB. So what the guidance sort of says, sorry, I'll come on to the guidance that I'm talking about in a second. It's the sort of NHSE guidance around the systems, and what it basically says is that you have to carefully consider whether an individual's role in another organisation could result in actual or perceived conflicts of interest. So could it influence the decision that they take? So such as a decision on how money is spent. So the fact that they have an interest in another organisation because they are employed or engaged by that organisation, does that mean that it could influence decisions they take? And in some cases, yes, potentially there is a perceived or a potential for conflict, but you have to consider whether there is indeed a conflict from that interest, and whether that outweighs the value of the knowledge that they bring to the process. So in other words, you can't say that there is a conflict such that they can't hold both roles, because the value of the experience and the knowledge that they bring to those forums is crucial in the decision-making process. So the whole reason why we have other individuals on an ICB board from outside of the ICB is to bring those valuable experiences and perspectives and knowledge to the ICB board. So simply the fact that they have that connection with an organisation external to the ICB doesn't mean that they necessarily have a conflict of interest, which means that they can't be involved in discussions and decision making. So in the conflict guidance from 2017 that I mentioned hasn't been updated or changed at all. It sets out some what it calls common sense management principles in terms of how conflicts are managed. And those management principles have not changed. So again, the same management principles are going to apply to how the ICB is going to manage conflicts with all of its partners within the system. So as I say, those have not changed at all, and I've set those out on that slide. So this is the guidance I was sort of alluding to before that hasn't changed the conflicts guidance from 2017, but just makes a couple of comments and has a bit of a section in there that is relevant to managing conflicts. And this is the NHSE guidance on ICB functions and governance that came out at the end of last year. And as I say, it has a section on there in conflicts, which doesn't change anything in terms of managing conflicts, but just has a bit of guidance in there, which I think is quite useful. I've picked out the bits that I think are particularly useful. So what it says is that the guiding principles are obviously that we have to avoid any undue influence when we make decisions as a public body. But it also makes the point that I just made before, which is that ICBs have been specifically created to give other partners, whether it be NHS providers, local authority partners, primary care, etc., a role in ICB decision making. So what the guidance says very clearly is that it shouldn't be assumed that they are personally or professionally conflicted just by virtue of holding a position with one of those other organisations, because by statute they have to be on that ICB board, so they're not conflicted automatically for that reason. So in order to establish whether there is a conflict that needs to be managed because of any of those loyalties, or because they might have other interests in other organisations, for example, in the same ways they would have done before ICBs were established, you have to distinguish between those individuals who should be involved in the formal decision taking and those whose input should simply inform decisions. So considering the perspective and the value and the experience that those individuals bring to into the discussion, you have to then take a decision about whether that individual should be involved in the discussion at all. Probably they should, because the whole reason they're there is to bring their experience, bring their perspective. But then the next decision is whether they should be involved in the actual decision-making process and be involved in the decision, i.e. As a consensus decision or by way of taking a vote. And that's the tricky one, really. And I think for a lot of ICBs, they're looking at where there is a perceived or an actual or a possible conflict because of individuals' roles. They're looking at having some form of default position where that individual joins in the discussion, but then removes themselves from the actual decision-making process. Now, obviously, that can be tricky if you have most of that forum or board having to excuse themselves because of a conflict, but it needs careful management. But the point to make is simply that those situations are potentially going to arise more and more because individuals are going to be wearing a number of hats across the system. And the guidance about how you manage that has not changed at all. It just needs very, very sort of careful and case-by-case management. But you could have, for example, a default position that where there is that sort of conflict, that you would that somebody would be removed from the decision-making bit of the discussion and not be involved in the decision, just to err on the side of caution. But I think it does have to be case-by-case decisions. What the guidance also says is that, you know, the way that you manage conflicts has to be proportionate, and you need to seek to preserve the spirit of collective decision making. The whole point of the collaboration and integration agenda is that you're collaborating, you're integrating, you're coming together to make decisions. So therefore, try to preserve that whilst also obviously managing the conflict. And that's why I say that in 99.9% of cases, that individual will probably still be involved in discussions, but perhaps then would remove themselves from the actual decision-making bit of the process. So I think that was everything. Yes, I'm just checking at the end of my slide. I think that was everything on conflicts. So the point there simply being not much has changed, nothing has changed in terms of the legislation or the guidance, but we do have these bits of guidance from the ICB functions and governance guidance, which came out at the end of last year, which just touches on managing conflicts and just reiterates, I think, how those could be managed within the system, within the ICB. So that's all we had to say. There's been a couple of bits in the chat, but I don't think I've responded to one of them. I don't think there was anything else that came up in the chat. Does anybody have a burning question? What I should say is this was always sort of badged as a webinar, and we were expecting quite a few people, which obviously we've got, which is great. Obviously, the downside of that is that the more people that attend, the less time we have for actual discussion, because it's more of a webinar rather than a discussion forum. But if there is anything at all, any questions you want to go through with us or ask us, by all means, I think our contact details are on a slide at the end. So by all means, oh, where's my picture gone? There it is. So by all means, contact either me or Esther, ask any questions, contact us by email, by phone. And if there's anything at all that we can help with, or you want to just run something past us, by all means, do ask. Does anybody have anything burning that they want to ask just for the last 2 minutes? Or have we stunned you all into silence?
I think we've stunned them.
Sorry, we appreciate that was a very sort of whistle-stop tour of possible governance issues for an ICB. There's quite a lot to talk about.
Yep, so you'll receive the slides as well after the session, and if anyone's got any feedback, Lorraine has just popped the link there as well, but we'll also send that through with the slides. Great.
Okay, thank you for your kind comments. Yeah. But as I say, anything at all, you know, please feel free to contact us. That's what we're here for, and you know, hopefully that's been useful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.